Has anyone ever told you to think in English, to stop translating in your head? I remember my Spanish teacher told me to think in Spanish. And when she told me that, I wasn't really quite sure how or why I should do that. You only have to spend 5 minutes on the internet to discover YouTube videos and blog posts and ebooks about thinking in English. But I watched those videos and I read those blog posts, and what I found were a lot of anecdotes and a lot of opinions. But I wanted to know what the science says about thinking in English, about translating in your head. So I asked myself 2 very simple questions. 1, is it possible to think in English? And number 2, is it a bad thing? What I discovered was both interesting and surprising. So, if you want to know the truth about thinking in English, then this video is for you. So let's start with the first question. Is it possible to think in English? This is how a lot of people think that languages are stored in the brain. I have one part of my brain, one section for English, and then another separate part of my brain for other languages that I learn, like Spanish. Now, because I'm a native English speaker, in my English part of my brain, I already have lots of words and grammatical structures stored in here, represented by these orange ping pong balls. And then when I learn another language, then as I learn words and grammatical structures, they go into this separate compartment in my brain. But scientists actually have a really good understanding of how languages are stored in the brain. And it's not like this at all. Let me show you how the brain actually stores languages. So we're going to start with a single word which I already know in English, which is banana. Now, I'm studying Spanish, so I discover that the word for banana in Spanish is plátano. So I put this word plátano in my brain with the word banana because they are associated. And then I realize that plátano is very similar to the English word plantain, which is a different type of banana in English. And then I realize that bananas are yellow. So that reminds me of taxis. And then I discover that taxi is the same in Spanish. So that goes in there as well. And then when I think about taxis, I think about also other types of vehicles like buses. And then I discover that the word in Spanish for bus is autobús. It's exactly the same, just with different pronunciation. And so soon, from this one word, I have this big soup of connections in my brain. This is what vocabulary and grammatical structures really look like. Now, I know what you're thinking. If all of this vocabulary and grammar is all mixed up in our brains, how can we possibly speak multiple languages? Let me show you. You see, when I want to use my second or third language, I need to suppress my English. It's a bit like holding these orange ping pong balls under the water. Now, at the beginning, when I first start learning, I don't have the skills. It's a bit like me trying to push down all of these orange ping pong balls with just one finger. Now, over time, I develop more skills. I am able to hold down more of the ping pong balls. But even if I am completely fluent, it is impossible for me to hold down 100% of these orange balls. This is just how the brain works. But what's really important to remember is that the ability, the skill to hold down these balls is something that comes with time and practice. So that brings us to the next question. Is it a bad thing to think in your native language? Is it a bad thing to translate in your head? To answer that question, we need to understand why we do this. Why do we translate in our head? The reason is working memory. When we are trying to process language, we're not looking at individual pieces of vocabulary or grammar. We are trying to get meaning. And in order to process meaning, we need to hold these ideas in our working memory. But the working memory of human beings has very strict and severe limitations. Let me demonstrate to you just how terrible your working memory is. I'm going to give you 5 words and I want you to try and memorize them. Ready? Apple, banana, pear, orange, watermelon. Now, how many of those 5 words do you think you can remember? Probably all of them. That's fantastic, well done. Now I'm going to give you another list of 5 words, and again I want you to try and memorize them. Ready? Beseech, venerable, flaunt, schism, ebullient. Now, how many of those words do you think you could remember? 1 or 2, or if you're super talented, maybe all of them. But I think we can all agree that the words on the second list were much more difficult to remember. But why? Because they had the same number of syllables, the same number of letters, and they took the same amount of time to pronounce. So, what's going on here? The answer is something called chunking. When we try to hold something in our working memory, we break it into chunks. But our working memory has very limited spaces for these chunks. One of the most famous papers in all of psychology suggests that we have somewhere between 5 and 9 spaces available for these chunks. Now, all of the words on the first list were all nouns. They were in the same category. And also they were all fruit, again in the same category. And they were also very common words. So all of these words are probably already in our long-term memory. So when we memorize this list, we only have 5 chunks to remember. It fits in our working memory. But the words on the second list are different. They are a mix of nouns and verbs and adjectives, and their meanings are not related. Also, they are very uncommon words, so they're not stored in our long-term memory. So, for example, when our brains try to memorize the first word, ebullient, maybe it breaks it into syllables. Ebullient. And then you start to think about that second syllable, bull, which you know is an English word for an animal with horns. And then, of course, that gets you thinking about the category of cows. And then you realize that the word ebullient is sort of similar to that French word bouillon, which is a type of French soup. Which then, of course, gets you thinking about that film Ratatouille with the little mouse chef. And then, of course, all of this put together, you start thinking about that famous Spanish restaurant, El Bulli, and suddenly you have all of these chunks and your working memory is completely full. And the other four words don't stand a chance. Research has shown us that students use mental translation for four main reasons. The first one is for unfamiliar grammatical structures and vocabulary. The second one is for understanding new vocabulary from context. The third one is to check the accuracy, to make sure that they are understanding the text. And the fourth one is to actually feel more confident. And that's really important. Mental translation helps students to pull the meaning out of the text. It moves all of that heavy processing from your short-term working memory into that long-term memory so that you can actually understand the meaning. And the other really important thing that the research shows us is that mental translation slowly reduces and decreases automatically with time and practice. But there is one type of mental translation that the science tells us is not effective. It will not help you to learn English. And that is word for word translation. I love the pizza. I love the pizza. I love the pizza. When we translate word for word like this, we move all of the thinking, all of the processing into our native language. We never process anything in the language we're learning. We never see the words together or understand the structures or how they work. You don't give your brain an opportunity to make those really important connections. So, you always want to be looking for meaning. To use mental translation to understand the entire idea or concept. You always need to be making an effort to hold down as many of those ping pong balls as possible. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Christian, please just tell me what to do. Just give me some special technique to help me reduce the amount of translating that I do in my head. Okay, I am going to give you a special technique, but first I want to show you two things. This is an article from the International Journal of Multilingualism. They proved that before you can turn off your native language, before you can start to think in another language, you need to have sufficient fluency. The new language needs to be activated enough in your brain before you can turn off the other language. It's not something that you're in conscious control of. In this study from the University of California, they showed that after 15 weeks of normal study with no changes to the curriculum or special techniques, the amount of mental translation that students did reduced by up to 37% in just 15 weeks. So, what is my special technique for you? Well, if you're working really hard and you're always reading and speaking and listening in English, the special technique is patience. So now I hope you understand that mental translation is a natural and unavoidable and important part of learning a new language. Thinking in English is something that comes with time and practice. Mental translation is not something to try and eliminate. So next time someone tells you to think in English, you can ask them, Do you know about the ping pong balls? Well, I hope you found this class interesting. If you would like to support free English education, there are two ways you can do that. You can become my patron on Patreon, or you can buy some very stylish Canguro English merchandise. If you would like to see any more videos about the English language, then don't forget to subscribe. I'm Christian, this is Canguro English. I'll see you in class.